What if I told you your bloating and gut issues aren't random? SIBO might be the cause, and today I'll help you fix it. Millions of people suffer from chronic bloating, fatigue, and gut issues without knowing why. Today I'll uncover the hidden conditions behind it, SIBO, and share how you can take control of your gut health. We need to understand what is SIBO and understand how it occurs. How did I learn this? As a personal trainer and massage therapist, I was in the best shape of my life, and I had this situation where I was bloating, my back would hurt from the bloating, I had all this joint pain, and so I hired consultant after consultant to help me figure out what was going on. I thought, oh, maybe I have a hormone issue, my hormones are dysregulated. I thought maybe with my weight training program. And when I got my blood work back, my inflammation levels were off the charts. And for a personal trainer who's healthy, having 3 times the inflammation of a normal person's level just didn't make any sense. And so I'm going to share with you, I learned from one of my mentors, Dave O'Brien, and I want to give him credit for helping me really understand SIBO. And a lot of things I'm going to teach you today are things he helped me understand. So first of all, what is SIBO? What does it stand for? It stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And so we have to understand, essentially, this is a digestive issue. And when we think about the stomach can be involved, but when we talk about SIBO, we're talking about what is actually going on inside the small intestine. And so the way you can think about digestion is you eat something, you then swallow that food, it goes down your esophagus, and it gets to this point here, and there's something called the gallbladder. And small intestinal bacterial overgrowth has been linked to gallbladder disease. And so what occurs, if you've ever heard someone say, I had to get my gallbladder removed, my gallbladder was irritated, SIBO. And so what occurs is that the bacteria actually builds up. And we're going to talk about many different kinds of bacteria that are involved in this, because that's the hardest part about SIBO, is understanding the different kinds of bacteria. And that's why one SIBO protocol might be great for one person and do absolutely nothing for another person. So when the food goes down, what happens, your body needs to clean that food. And so you release digestive enzymes, you release acids, and one of the things that you release to digest food is called bile, and bile comes from what's called the gallbladder. And so your body will then release these acids and start cleaning food. These acids and this bile, they go in and they start breaking down food particles. Now, your body really needs the ability to break down fats, because fats are very dense, and that's why a lot of people are drawn to sugar. So if you're someone who's drawn to sugar, that's very normal. And so a lot of times it's not just a self-control issue, it's that your body cannot break down the denser micronutrients and macronutrients. So to be able to get protein, to be able to get fat, to be able to digest these, your body is struggling to do that, because being able to create the digestive enzymes to do that is very costly for the body. Here's what happens is that your body tries to release the bile, but because you have some kind of overgrowth of bacteria, which is what small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is, as your food goes from stomach to small intestine, there is actually a blockage. And so then that blockage and that overgrowth of small intestine of that bacteria actually stops you from being able to move that food through effectively. And then we can get a lot of gas, we can get a lot of bloating, or we can even get diarrhea. And we're going to talk about how each of these is caused by different kinds of bacteria. In summary of this first section, what is SIBO? It is a blockage where the small intestine itself gets full of bacteria. It then creates this top-level transition problem where the gallbladder is releasing bile, but the bile doesn't get there. It doesn't clean the food. The bacteria then creates that blockage. It can backflow and give you small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, but of course, it can give you an irritated gallbladder. So now let's look at the different kinds of bacteria that can cause this. So the first kind of chemical we're going to talk about is hydrogen. And so when we think about different bacteria, they help us process foods, absorb foods, and hydrogen, for example, is something that the body needs to absorb, it needs to process. And so where do we get hydrogen from? Very simple, carbohydrates. And so when you eat 1 ounce of carbohydrates, it creates 10 quarts of gas. So 10 quarts of hydrogen gas inside the body. And so you can think about all the bloating that happens. And it's very common to see people that are not necessarily super obese, but they have very distended, very big stomachs. And that could be a sign of hydrogen-based bacteria that has overgrown, especially in the small intestine area. And so by eating too many carbohydrates or just consuming carbs, let's say, too frequently, somebody can actually create these gas exchange issues. And that is one way that bacteria can become imbalanced. The other thing that happens is that inside your small intestine, you have something called archaea. And archaea is very interesting because I was talking to my wife about this, and she was very good in biology. And she goes, wow, this whole subsystem didn't exist in biology. And so there are actually new things like eukaryocytes, and there are new things like archaea. And it's very interesting because in biology, they're always discovering new things. But you have something called archaea, which is a single-cell organism inside the small intestine, and it consumes hydrogen. And so then it consumes hydrogen and it makes methane, okay? Methane, which is very interesting, is going to give you more of constipation. And so you have people that fluctuate between having too much diarrhea, which is the hydrogen, and too much constipation, which is the methane. So what their body's essentially doing is sometimes they're eating too much carbohydrates, let's say, or they have too much of that bacteria grown in their stomach, and they're like, oh, I'm really constipated. And then all of a sudden they go, oh my gosh, now I have like explosive diarrhea. And so go back and forth between the two. So obviously, how can you get this? You can get this just by over-consuming foods that are too high in these things. The third thing is sulfur. And so what is sulfur? Sulfur, actually, that gas is created from lean proteins. And so this is where a lot of bodybuilders end up running into issues. And so what they do is they eat a lot of lean proteins, like chicken breast, and those are very high in sulfur. They can eat things like cabbage, which is also very high in sulfur. You can eat things like cauliflower, which are very high in sulfur. And so even though these are good high-volume foods, they actually create a lot of gas exchange. And so whatever sulfur-based bacteria they have in the body, it is being fed all the time. And so when we do something like a stool test, which we'll get into when we talk about testing, there are different levels of how overgrown something can be. And if they find it on the test, that's a 1+. And if there's more than that, it goes 2+, and then 3+, and then it maxes out at 4+. So let's say you're walking around, you have a little bit of this sulfur-based bacteria, and you go, I'm going to start a weight loss program. And so I need to eat more lean protein. And so you start eating a lot of chicken breast all the time. And now that 1+ of sulfur-based bacteria goes to a 2+. And then you're like, yeah, I have really bad farts when I drink all these protein shakes. Oh, really interesting. And then you go to a 3+, and you keep drinking the protein shake at a 4+. And so these are different ways that people can create these overgrowths in the gut because they could be over-consuming too much hydrogen-based food matter. They could be consuming too much methane-based food matter. They can be consuming too much sulfur-based food matter. And you can get a mix of all three of these, and each one of these requires you to change your diet, but also requires you to introduce different things to address them in the system. Okay, so let's talk about testing. One of the things we can think about here is if someone, or you're watching this and you're thinking, well, I have gut issues and I've been diagnosed with ulcers and all those things, we can take some of this data and know something like ulcers and H. pylori are very highly correlated to each other. And we have different kinds of things like negative gram-bacteria, positive gram-bacteria. But we have different testing methods we can use. And now the thing with all testing is pretty much inaccurate. So we don't like to use one piece of test. This is one thing my mentors showed me, is that if you just use one piece of testing, you just look at one thing and you say either it's here or not very accurate. And so the biggest one that I see a lot of are people that did breath test. And so if you don't know what the breath test is for SIBO, is they basically give you different sugar molecules and they basically see how those sugars turn into gases in your stomach. And if you have an issue with that, and it comes back out when you blow into the test unit. And so the issue with this is that, one, there are different kinds of molecules for sugar, and there's different complexities of sugars. And a lot of times when they test these, they don't test all of these complexities. The second is we just talked about like sulfur-based SIBO, we talked about methane, we talked about hydrogen, we talked about histamine issues, we talked about estrogen issues, we talked about stomach acid. None of that is in that test. And if you think, if every test is not that valuable, not that accurate in itself, it doesn't really make sense to run that test because there is not enough overall information on that. We don't know how the lining's doing. We don't know if the lining's stretched. We don't know if it's over-permeable. We don't know if there's high levels of the TVRP, whatever receptor. The information's not there. That is not my favorite to go to, but a lot of times clients will call me and they will say, hey, I've had this done and it was negative, but I have all the symptoms. Or they'll say, hey, I had it done and it was positive, and we did something for it, but it didn't fix it. And the reason why is that one test doesn't tell us how to treat the whole body. It's too limited. Okay? So the second thing we have, which is a lot of people might think it's obvious, hopefully it is, what about a stool test? Very simple. You go in and you fill up a vial with poop. You usually fill up a couple days, and then you got some frozen ones, and they grow it in the lab, and they see what's in it. And you have different levels of bacteria, not only the amount, but you can also see which bacteria are supposed to be there, which aren't supposed to be there. And so you can use that as one of your tools. But we have to think about every test in the same way we thought about the breath test. where the weakness of the test. So what is the weakness of the stool test? Well, the weakness of the stool test is quite simple, is that stool comes from the large intestine. And we're trying to figure out what? Small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And so that means that we're doing a test for this organ, but we're trying to get information from here. And also, if the small intestine is filling up and it starts to backflow on the stomach, that bacteria could be higher up. And so we may not even see it here. So if you're using that test, it can be a helpful test, but you really have to correlate that data, because as a proximity test, it may not be as effective. We talked a little about ulcers and H. pylori, and I think that's really helpful to understand, because when we talk about solutions, this becomes very relevant, is that the different kinds of bacteria, you have what's called positive gram and negative gram bacteria. And this is something most people don't really understand. But negative gram bacteria is invulnerable to antibiotics. You can't not get negative gram bacteria away with antibiotics. Positive gram bacteria, which is a lot of your good microbiome, is positive gram bacteria. That is very susceptible to antibiotics. It's very easily to get rid of. And so what is the difference between the two? Is that the positive gram bacteria, the outside membrane that protects that cell is made out of carbohydrates. Okay, and carbohydrates like glucose, like we said earlier, some people don't do well eating fats and proteins when they have SIBO, is because they cannot process those nutrients. They're too dense to break down. Carbohydrates are very easy to get rid of, so something like an antibiotic can totally get through that cell wall. Now we got negative gram bacteria like H. pylori, and that is a very thick cell wall. It's not made out of carbohydrate. It's actually made out of fats, it's made out of metals, and it's made out of things like iron and mercury. Okay, and so if you have consistently low iron, one of the things you might consider, even, and I have clients tell me this all the time, I've had iron transfusions. After iron transfusion, my iron's chronically low, negative gram bacteria. Okay, so your body is getting the iron pulled out of it so this bacteria can make itself stronger and stronger. And in that case, if you give iron to the body, you are actually feeding the membrane of that protective mechanism. And so when we think about what we're doing here, we have to think, do I need something in order to get the encasement out around this bacteria? And that's the issue with the stool test, is if you just take a stool test, the bacteria is actually encased in the biofilm. And so you run the stool test and it comes back negative, because the limitation of the testing is it doesn't get through the biofilm. So if you're going to run these tests, you have to do really specific things to make sure that they come out well, okay? And that leads us to blood testing, which is our third. Okay, we have blood testing, which is going to be a way that you can actually look at a snapshot of the body. To use the blood testing, you have to know a lot about all the different cofactors the body needs. You have to understand the trends of what happens when someone has negative gram bacteria in the body. So for example, negative gram bacteria, when they inject the byproduct of negative gram bacteria, which is called LPS toxicity, is lipopolysaccharide toxicity. It's called an endotoxin, which is a toxin that comes from inside the body when you have these processes going, is they actually find that there are certain things that happen to the liver, okay? And so we can also understand that anytime you have these toxicities, your body's going to have to process these through your detox systems, and you're going to have stress on the liver. And so you can see those inside the test if you know how to read these tests. And so there are different things. We're talking about small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, but you can also have what's called small intestinal fungal overgrowth. Okay, you can have fungus actually build up in that area too. And there are different patterns for bacterias, and there are different patterns for fungus, and there are different patterns for parasites. And so when you read blood testing, essentially, you cannot read if it's just high or it's low. It really is not that helpful. You have to think about blood testing as correlated test in the same way that we thought about stool testing as a proximity test. And so I really like those three types of testing. There's also organic acid testing. Okay, organic acid testing is a urine test, and that is going to show you different toxins and the things that aren't digested, and then also damaged DNA and all that stuff. And that can be helpful too. I would save that for a whole different area of what I would want to look at. I don't think that's as helpful as the other two. And so those are the different ways. Thank you for watching this video on small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Hope you learned a lot. YouTube thinks you like this next video, so go ahead and watch it. Hopefully it'll take you to the next piece of information that you need.